First of all, thank you all for coming. I'm Chris Beam. I'm Managing Director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. Happy that you can join us. Welcome. All right. I'm not going to remember everything. First of all, sign-up sheet, if you're here for extra credit, it's here. If I could just ask someone to just pass that around. Just up and down the road, please. Also, we're going to be speaking a lot about the Undertow Jeff's books. So just so happens that the bookstore is outside selling copies. So if you're interested, that would be something to avail yourself of. I also expect that most of you here have signed up for our newsletter. But if you haven't, it's a great opportunity to find out what we're doing. It's at our website, democracy.psu.edu. Very easy to do. We are working / struggling, trying to respond to the times in which we find ourselves. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll find out what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and so you won't miss anything. Speaking of responding to the times, Jeff Sharlet is the Frederick Sessions Beebe Class of 35 professor in the art of writing and director of creative writing at Dartmouth College and author of The Undertow: Scenes from a Slow Civil War. He's an outstanding writer, and he is also at his core a journalist. The Undertow is a series of stories about conversations he had with Americans all over the country. He was trying to understand, in his words, how and why some of us believe what we're believing lately. Now in his Substack, which I also encourage you to sign up for, he has updated those efforts and acknowledges that what he used to call a slow civil war doesn't seem so slow anymore. So what do we do, he asks. The theorists have failed us. It's who, what, where, when, why time. And now the slam of theorists cuts a little close to the bone for me, but I'm going to let that go. And then he goes on. The who, what, where, when, why has always been about more than the news. Implicit in its formula is a question about the dreams of others, which aren't always lovely. Now that is certainly true, and the moment itself is not particularly lovely either. But understanding it is an indispensable part of dealing with it. All to say, we need people like Sharlet more than ever, and that's why we're lucky to have him with us here today. So please join me in welcoming him. Go get him.
Thanks, Chris. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. And thank you to Michael Berkman and to Jenna Spinelli and to the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, which I'm going to stand next to. Much love for the theorists. Much love for the theorists. But I am going to speak today more from what might be experienced as anecdotal, but I think of in terms of the accumulation of spending decades sort of traveling the country and trying to understand something in particular about what used to be called the Christian right or the religious right, now then the far right or the Trumpist right. These movements have what to me are a very different idea of what this means, democracy, and have what they experience as utopian imagination. Part of what always draws me to these movements is because they are almost always, not quite always, but almost always so much more complex than their caricatures. And when I say complex, I do not appeal to your sympathy. They are oftentimes more complex in their caricatures, and that their plans are better laid and more thorough. But nonetheless, they invite examination. But they also instill in me sometimes fear. I think sort of many journalists over time, if you spend enough time, you end up sooner or later on on the wrong side of a gun, and it's frightening. And so I'm going to start really with the last line of the book, the last line of this book, The Undertow. I decided it's about, the undertow is the currents that brought us here to this moment, and it's about sort of some of this reporting over the years. But I decided to bookend it with two stories of singers, mostly forgotten. And the last line of the book is from a chapter called The Good Fight is the One You Lose. It's a title that works well for almost every day lately. And it's about a man named Lee Hayes, which maybe a few of the older folks here remember, was part of an outfit called the Weavers, which if you go back to 1948, 1949, was one of the most popular singing groups in America. His songwriting partner was Pete Seeger. Songs like If I Had a Hammer and On Top of Old Smoky and Kisses Sweeter Than Wine, until they were blacklisted as communists, which they were. That wasn't a false accusation in their case, although as Lee would like to say, we were the singing kind. But the last line of the book comes from a moment when Lee, who was this hulking guy, giant guy, but not physically brave, not a physically brave man, and he would confess this to himself, and he's talking about being in Arkansas, where he was from, rural Arkansas, and he is in what he describes as a rump-sprung car, a car that is falling apart, and he's with a group of union organizers. They're white and black. This is 1930s Arkansas, and on behind them, chasing them, is a car full of company gun thugs, and they're terrified, and they think this is it. And so he says, we start singing together. And they're singing songs, they're singing labor songs, but they had all grown up in the church, these men, and they start reverting to hymns. They were communists, this didn't mean the same thing to them, but it gave them a kind of courage, a moment together. And he said, this line from his memoir, which I thought was so powerful that I ended this book with it, for a while it was possible not to be scared even. For a while, it was possible not to be scared even. So I'm going to start with that and come around to that, because that is my position of hope right now, is for a while it's possible not to be scared even, which is about the kind of moments that we carve out together. I think of democracy, and I'm sure here many scholars do, as not a thing that we just have, or that is sort of laid on top of us, but a thing that we do, a thing that we make together. For a while, it is possible not to be scared even is another way, I think, of speaking of democracy. And I want to speak a little bit about how not to be scared. But first, I'm going to do what I can to scare you. And not that there's any shortage of fear today, but to be honest, I don't think there's enough. I think we need to take more seriously, even more seriously, what is happening, what has happened and has been building for a long time. And then I'll come back around, maybe, if I can get there, to not being scared. So I said, I've been spending about 25 years now traveling around the country, reporting on religious and political movements, mostly within the US, sometimes abroad. And most of them not most of them, many of them are lovely, gorgeous movements of imagination. But many are fueled by the fear that left to sit can curdle into a kind of hate. And I think I can report accurately that the latter kind, the curdled kind, is growing. Some examples. A church called the Church of Glad Tidings in Yuba City, Oklahoma, which no longer displays the cross because the pastor told me now is a time of war, and where the pulpit is made of swords, and Tuesdays are for militia training. You may have seen a briefly viral video in which the church presented to General Mike Flynn a customized AR-15. With which he said he might go hunting in Washington. That was General Mike Flynn, briefly Trump 1's national security advisor, banished into the wilderness of QAnon, and restored more recently back to a position of Trump world influence, if not an administration position. Or another church, Word of Faith Fellowship in Spindale, North Carolina, a church Trump celebrates for the ministry team it dispatched to hundreds of his rallies, understanding its religious mission to do all that it could for Trump, who it believed was selected for the presidency by God, that being its understanding of democracy. God chooses. I decided I would like to attend this church. That's not as easily done as you might think. 2 teams of security guards and SUV as I'm driving down the driveway this past December. 2 teams of security guards and SUVs sort of squealed up and cut off the driveway. It was just like an action movie. It would have been very exciting, except that it was real. And I thought, this is it, I'm not going to get in, and that's the best I can say this. And then when they started grilling me on my home church, I said I was a travel writer, which is true. I travel around, and wherever I am on Sunday, I usually go to a church to see what's happening in that community. But they asked me about my home church, and I said, well, the game is up. I'm Jewish. And I thought that was surely going to be the end of it. They had, they were like sort of Secret Service men with wires and, some conferring and talking. Send them down. I'm brought in. I'm put into the front place, and they are there. They say, as a Jew, I have a role to play in prophecy, and I am invited to pray with them to the God, their God, whom they call a God of war. They said, our God is a God of war. This is a curdling of hate, I think. Even more recently, On Fire Ministries in Spokane, Washington. Sunday before last, I attended services. It was actually, much of it was a lot of fun. It's a lively, diverse congregation. The music is fabulous. There's kids running around and dancing. And for some of these the boys, the church's pastor endorses combat training to prepare for the war with those he deems Marxists. And this is not figurative. He was a state legislator in Washington, 6-term state legislator in Republican leadership, until a report revealed his involvement and or potential involvement, 3 armed events of political violence. He left the legislature and now does full-time church work, in which capacity he has developed a plan, and I'm quoting, to kill all males who don't submit to biblical law. They reassured me that that's in the future. I was fine. They knew who I was. Enjoy the music. There's plenty of time to submit. And the good news is that was too much for the Republican Party of Washington. He was pushed out of his leadership position. There are still lines. You can still cross them. And such churches remain exceptions. They are what we speak of as the fringe. But much of what been trying to do as a journalist, what I tried to do in this book, The Undertow, was to call our attention to the fringe. The way I understand a place is I go and I look at its margins and I see where are its margins and where are they moving. One part of The Undertow is dedicated to what, when I encountered it first in 2013, 2014, was called the men's rights movement, dedicated to the idea that men are the oppressed class in society, that men are actually the victims of sexual assault, not women. And I said most groups are more interesting than their caricature. This one, their caricature was pretty dumb, and they were dumber. And I got there, and really they wanted to mainly complain about their ex-wives. They did not seem like a movement that would one day have one of its own, an icon of the manosphere, Andrew Tate, a man, an influencer, indicted, I believe, in Romania for sex trafficking, welcomed back to the United States by Trump, celebrated by high figures in Trump world. That fringe, that margin moves to the center. These churches about which I'm talking about, which remain fringe, but are worth paying attention to, because there are more of them. They're not at the center yet. That's the good news. You can still cross lines. But they are moving in that direction. And I would like, the good fight is the one you lose. We lose ground. We're losing ground right now, I believe. But the slow civil war that is the subtitle of my book is one in which we can be aware. This is why I want us to be aware, to be afraid of these churches so that we can, in our fear, find our courage. I think about the movement of these churches, and I want to tell you about one more in Nebraska. Lord of Hosts, a suburban megachurch with its own armed militia, where a church usher and a gunman in full tactical gear followed me into a public parking lot to tell me that as a journalist, I was automatically demonic. There was no longer a question of good journalists and bad journalists. I was a journalist. This has changed. For much of my writing life, it didn't matter how right-wing the church I went to was. It didn't matter. They looked me up, they knew who I was, and they say, we know you're godless heathen. But it's okay, we'll talk to you, because through you, the good word will get out. So many of them believe, they said, well, you know, God believes in free speech, which, yeah, thank you, Chris, for looking up. No, that's not in the Bible, and no, he does not. But so many American churches, that was a different kind of Christian nationalism, was imagining that the First Amendment, what some churches call the God-breathed Constitution, it cut both ways. For a time, it meant, all right, we'll let the journalists in the door. This church did not. I was automatically demonic, no matter how polite I might pretend to be, and I had to leave. I had a notebook with me and a mechanical pencil. I always write with mechanical pencils, and I held up my pencil. And it was sort of ridiculous. I was, you know, a pencil, you click it and the lead kind of comes out and then it falls out. I was clicking the lead. Look, it's a pencil, to show its harmlessness. And I said to the usher, I said, he was backed up by this man in tactical gear with a gun, but the usher was in a jacket. And I said, I have only a pencil and you brought a man with a gun. And the gunman stepped forward and the usher grinned. And it was to me a very frightening smile. And he leaned in very close to ask, he says, how do you know I don't have a gun? This is new for me in American churches. How do you know I don't have a gun? And I think of this as, in some senses, one of the American questions right now. How do you know I don't have a gun? There are 400 million guns and counting in civilian hands in the United States. An awful lot of us have a gun. And in my time crisscrossing this country, thinking about how are you experiencing this moment, I encounter more and more people than I've seen in decades who say they are ready to use them, who practice and train and fly American flags in which the stripes are made up of long guns and the stars are replaced by handguns, or who fly American flags that show nothing at all. The colors all gone to pure darkness. Not a black flag, it's an American flag. Catch the light a little bit, you can still see the shapes. This is a flag. If you see this flag, if you have a neighbor flying this flag, watch out. If you're flying this flag, please let me know now. It is like so much of the history of the far right. They attribute it to the Civil War. It's not really true, but that's okay. That's the legend that they have. They believe it comes from Stonewall Jackson, that it's a flag that stands for no mercy, take no prisoners, kill everybody, kill all males. It is a flag that brings to mind a verse, a battle verse that I encounter more and more as I travel around, Joshua 1:9, book of Joshua 1:9, which on its face is a pretty simple verse about having courage and going forth, but is understood and was understood for a long time as that, as a form of spiritual war. Spiritual war, which if you are a secular person sounds scary, but for a long time meant mainly personal struggle, you know, to be a better person. In the same way that jihad sounds scary to some, but of course jihad means for most the same. Internal struggle. How do I be the person that I want to be. But we are in a time of metaphors that concretize, metaphors that become solid. And so that Joshua 1:9, for a long time you could buy from the merch store of Congresswoman Lauren Boebert's Shooter's Grill. Anyone know about Shooter's Grill? In the town of Rifle, Colorado. I mean, she's all in. Lauren Boebert is a far-right Trump congresswoman, and she opened a restaurant, and the idea, her theme restaurant, is it would be like Hooters, except that the waitresses, who would wear tight cut-off jean shorts, would open carry guns. Shooters, not Hooters. And their merch, this was a godly enterprise. Don't think this is profane. This was a godly enterprise. Their merch was all emblazoned with Joshua 1:9. Now, some of you may know the book of Joshua and may even understand how it has come to be used. How, for instance, on January 5th, 2021, there was a Jericho march around the Capitol. That God says to Joshua in this interpretation, go into the city and kill everybody. Kill everybody. So when I see Joshua 1:9 on a t-shirt, when I see Joshua 1:9 on a militia uniform, I understand that this is a different idea of what conflict is. I understand when I see that flag that stands for no mercy, that's a Joshua 1:9 flag. And I say, this flag is asking me a question. And if how do you know I don't have a gun is one American question, I think this is the Civil War question. This is a Civil War question. Another who asked this question is our Secretary of Defense, former Fox News host Pete Hegseth. Now, in the run-up to Hegseth's confirmation, much was made of his vice-filled past. He had a pretty serious drinking problem. He was a philanderer. There were allegations of sexual assault, which is to say, and not to diminish that last one at all, the American political press remained in the space of scandal. He's a drinker. That was actually the biggest. The New Yorker dedicated a whole article to the discovery of his heavy drinking. My problem with him was not so much the drinking, which he would not be the first cabinet secretary to be a heavy drinker. My problem was the way in which he approached the Civil War question. And our political press, still attuned to the scandal politics of another time, ignored his actual beliefs, which he had spelled out in 4 books, the most recent of which, published last year, is called The War on Warriors. And he begins it by boasting of being drummed out of the army as an extremist, in which he describes diversity in the military as an infection, and American cities as enemy territory, turned by what he calls indigenous populations into Samaras, by which he means to compare them to the Iraqi city in which he was deployed in combat. True Americans, he writes, have been stabbed in the back by secret Marxists among us, but soon he promises it will be time for round 2. Round 2. And if you're wondering, what could he mean? What was round 1? What was round 1? He clears that up. He says, we won't miss this war. Elsewhere in the book, he doesn't invoke Joshua. He invokes the story of Gideon. You know those Gideon Bibles you find in the hotel room? The story is actually quite a violent one. And it's one in which he finds special encouragement because he says, you know what Gideon did before he went and he fought the enemy? He purged his camp. He went amongst and found the enemy within. This is how the Secretary of Defense understands things. Now, you can say, well, he's not doing any of this, right? Well, first of all, no, he's purging his camp. He is cleansing the infection. He is driving officers out. But more to the point are the promises, and they are still just promises. They are what the political press likes to dismiss as just theater. It's just theater. Talk of war with Canada, talk of seizing Greenland, just theater. Talk of tariffs was just theater until it wasn't. Talk of pardons for 1,500 January 6ers was just theater until it wasn't. Right now, the floated idea of reparations for J6ers, for all that they suffered on our behalf, that remains just theater until maybe it's not. And I come from a space as a writer, as one who's drawn to thinking about stories. I don't trust the dismissal of just theater. Theater is powerful. Our idea that this is just theater is our failure to step into the politics of the Trumpocene. The Trumpocene, this age in which Trump, for both left and right, is the great kind of toxic cloud in which our discussions occur. I think about this in terms of, in the Undertow, I kind of try and outline what I see as sort of three different religious phases of Trumpism. Going back to 2016, he comes on the scene with something called the prosperity gospel. This is the idea that God wants you to be rich. And the way you can prove this is if you kick up to your pastor, some of it'll trickle down to you. That's the promise in 2016. So much winning, you're going to get tired of winning, the prosperity gospel. But by 2020, it's changed. And now it's a theology of secrets. It's a theology of conspiracies. It's shaped by QAnon. And I think of it as a kind of a bastardized Gnostic gospel. The idea that there is one official story, but underneath it is another story that is just as dangerous. That's the deep state. And then beyond that, you can find the true essence, which in Trumpism is Trump. On January 6, 2021, we came to the third movement. When a young white woman named Ashley Babbitt, crawling through a broken window, bringing with her a knife to storm the Capitol on behalf, as she said, of Trump and Jesus, was shot dead by a police officer who happened to be a black man, and sort of setting in motion immediately a very old American lynching story of an innocent white woman struck down by a black man. This is the first film ever. Anyone know the first film to show in the White House? Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's movie based on a novel called The Klansman, which is about a Klansman, and he's the hero. The KKK are the heroes. In the first movie ever shown in the White House, a white woman flees to her death from a black man who is sort of bestial in this movie, and then the Klan must ride in her vengeance. So it was with the martyr myth of Ashley Babbitt. And Trump brought us into an age of political martyrdom, And then when those trials comes, he says, move over, Ashley, you've been keeping the cross warm, but I'm ready to ascend. I think now we're past even that. I don't know what to call this moment. I think of it as maybe we're in the phase of ritual sacrifice, certainly a time of performance in which videos of deportations are dispensed by the White House as entertainment, in which even deportations that they want to do, like the young Tufts student, the first time they took the Columbia student, they took him in a hallway. It took several days for video to get out. The second time, when they took the Tufts student, they arranged for 6 agents to surround her on a street where there was no question that there would be witnesses, meant to be seen. And so it has been meant to encounter her being disappeared. The stakes are rising, and the temptation is to call this a crisis of democracy, just as we face a climate crisis, as we may or may not quite be in a constitutional crisis. But I think a better word for it that allows for a hope, not what some have come to call hopium, is our condition. These circumstances that we're in right now, we're in it, are our condition. A crisis as a narrative term suggests resolution, not necessarily a happy resolution. There's that arc of storytelling. A character encounters a conflict and achieves resolution. It might be defeat, it might be victory, but a crisis suggests an outcome. And I don't think we're in that moment. In fact, I think our crisis thinking has tempted us away from the long struggle that we need to be in right now. It tempts us even now as like, well, just hold on to 2026. And elections, of course, can function as a crisis narrative in which there will be an outcome and a resolution. But I think instead we face a condition. And the reason I think it's important to understand that is when you know that you are living with a condition, it invites empathy, not sympathy, but empathy. That distinction is important. Empathy is not a virtue. Empathy, you can have empathy for the devil, just as we have sympathy for the devil, right? You can have empathy for what does it feel like? How does it make sense? How does it make sense to have a Joshua 1:9 AR-15? I want to share one piece from the book. It's a close reading of an incident that I chose because it's of no significance. This was not a national incident. It made no national news. It didn't even make local news. It was a woman who was sort of caught up in what she was reading online and took action. And it was only one reader sort of noticing the police report and then poking around and calling around, I was able to get close to something of what it felt like, I think. So I'm going to share this little passage. She saw shadows. She always had. She was spiritual, not Christian. She had left that behind when she had left Waco in her early 20s, Waco, Texas. She got into Wicca, super witchy, said a friend. She was fun, happy, a little wild, just a normal girl. I'll call her Evelyn because she's a hostage now, a captive of the beliefs that swarm any public mention of her real name. Not that she's special. She's not notorious. There are Evelyns everywhere. This Evelyn was in Austin, Texas. She was 30. She liked to party. She had a broad mountain girl face and forest-colored eyes, and her long brown hair ran to honey at the ends. She worked when she could. Sometimes she stripped. She had a boyfriend who took care of her. She had never had much luck holding a job. When she lost one, she'd go home. That's how it was, back and forth between Waco, her family, and Austin, her friends, right to left, red to blue. She was bright, a good listener, says one friend, a liberal lawyer whom Evelyn liked to call freedom fighter. She was gullible, says another friend, the one who introduced Evelyn to QAnon not long into the pandemic. And I want to pause here because QAnon is almost sort of yesterday's news. Who believes in QAnon anymore? QAnon, that furious moment that accelerated so rapidly that if you look closely at even Trump's iconography now, you find all these little Q tells. But I would suggest that the ethos of QAnon, which is that Gnostic, bastardized Gnostic gospel, reading for secret signs, endures. It endures, for instance, when we hear our Attorney General, Pam Bondi, explain to us that this man from Maryland who has been sent to a prison in El Salvador not to return is a member of MS-13. And how does she know? She just knows. There are signs. There are signs if you can read them. He had a Chicago Bulls hat, if you know how to read the signs. And the broad acceptance that there will be secrets we can't know, that a hat could mean something else, that a tattoo, another man deported for a tattoo, we've probably seen this, that was a rainbow ribbon in support of his brother who was autistic. But perhaps this has a secret meaning. I want to argue that ethos of QAnon endures. But Evelyn at first did not believe in it, or the friend didn't believe in it and didn't think that Evelyn would. But because they were bored and locked down and stuck at home and staring at screens, they went down the rabbit hole. For shits and giggles, said Evelyn's friend, nothing more, which is how Evelyn came to believe that the shadows she'd seen within Wicca as the nuances of life were actually the satanic forces of which QAnon warned. She learned an anonymous figure, she learned an anonymous figure on a message board was in fact a government insider. He revealed President Trump's decades-old plan to destroy the deep state, the satanic forces. It's been going on for centuries, she wrote to her friend, freedom fighter. Q communicated through cryptic drops. She thought this wise. Q could transmit only to those willing to discern. Evelyn discerned. She followed the white rabbit. She went further down the rabbit hole. She drank more. Her mind raced. Her hair grew wild. Her skin became ashen, except when it flushed with color. She could feel her blood moving, she said, in strange ways. And so what she did, because she came to believe in the numbers that 800,000 children are being abducted a year. That's also the number that compelled Ashley Babbitt to storm the Capitol and go to her death. It is actually factually correct in the sense that 800,000 children are for a brief period declared missing when a babysitter isn't where they're supposed to be or a parent doesn't get there in time. The numbers of abductions are much tinier. But she stopped at that first alarming number and acted on it. She thought about what is the politics, what is the spiritual truth I need to act upon. So she went to stop the baby stealer. She got into her little car and she went looking for them, and she saw a catering van and a woman with a child she was stealing, was her daughter, and she began chasing that car. And then she saw another woman who she was sure was stealing someone, and she chased her into a parking lot and rammed her van over and over and over. And thank God nobody was killed. Nobody was killed. The woman in the van was injured. Evelyn is in prison. Lives were ruined. And it starts with someone who was lonely and scared and looking for meaning and thinking about children. And to this we can bring empathy. Not sympathy, empathy. We can bring understanding. What is it that compels you to act? But I do have sympathy, and I want to sort of come around at the end here. I do have sympathy. As a professor, as some of you are, we see young people terrified of the world in which they're coming of age. I have 2 children. I have an 11-year-old who won't watch nature documentaries because they all end so grimly. Look at this beautiful species. Look at this incredible ecosystem. Anyway, it's going to be gone. He won't go to the Boston Aquarium. A Boston Aquarium is apocalyptic at this point. This is hard to grow up into. I said I have 2 children. I have an older child who has struggled with mental illness, the same and maybe in some ways akin to Evelyn. And they gave me permission to talk about this and want me to talk about it, which is why I do. They struggled with mental illness. They struggled with the isolation of the pandemic, and those scars are still there. And that struggle continues. And that's the word that I kind of want to come around to, the alternative to that fear, or for the way it's possible not to be scared for a while. I reject crisis, as I say, because it implies resolution and either victory or defeat. Victory is a sweet dream. It's also the delusion that consumed Evelyn. I embrace struggle. I embrace struggle because it doesn't have a beginning and an end. My child lives with those hard memories of that isolation, I think, as do we all. And we all live with climate change. That's a condition. That's not a crisis. The glaciers that have melted are not coming back. There may be a way in which we learn to live with this, but we're not getting back what was lost. We're not getting back what was lost in our history of peaceful transfer of power. That's gone. We're not getting back the delusion that America is somehow uniquely immune to authoritarianism. That's gone too. So we live with these conditions. And the only way to live with them is to keep struggling. And that struggle, as a parent, it asks of me love, but more than that, solidarity. My child is trans. And every trans child now in America is on the front lines of this slow civil war. And I think I call it a slow civil war because there are casualties. And talking about this, I want to talk about another young man named Ashton Clatterbuck, a young trans man who grew up in struggle because a pipeline was trying to, not the one in Standing Rock, they were trying to build a pipeline through his backyard, not far from here, I guess, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And his family said no. And then he transitioned as a teenager. And then he stood in line at a General Mike Flynn event. He stood in line to meet him, to shake his hand and say, I just want you to know you just shook a trans man's hand. He was a man of great courage until he was broken, and last year he took his own life. And in talking about this, I bring up Ash, a nephew of a dear friend, because he was brave, and because he lost that fight, and because we're still here and the struggle continues. So if we look at that, well, why would you tell me that story? Because we're still here, because we are called to solidarity with the trans children among us, because they are us. Anything less is a submission to the delusions that consume the minds of Evelyn, that is burning through our many churches, that is seizing control of school boards. I think of a school board member I met in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Her proposal was that we should just stop teaching science altogether. That is persuading so many young men that being a man means being angry. The struggle demands not support, but solidarity. If my child is targeted, I'm targeted. And if I'm targeted, you're targeted. And I think we're learning that in a very real way. A tough student who writes an op-ed is gone. Here at Penn State, a number of students have their visas revoked. At Dartmouth, where I teach, students who, people are searching for any hint of political. We can't find it. Gone. In Vermont, where I live, a young man shows up after living in the United States for 10 years for what he is told will be his citizenship interview. He's so excited he brings a state legislator with him to witness it, and instead she witnesses a group of masked men sweep him into an unmarked car. There is no other. There's only us right now, and I think that's why I wanted to end with solidarity and struggle, because the struggle is long. And I told Chris that I was going to end with a singer. I think actually this room might be old enough. Some of you will know who he is. I bracketed the book with these old forgotten singers who lived the long struggle. Lee Hayes, the Weavers, who gave us that American songbook. And I began it with a man named Harry Belafonte. Some in the room know Harry Belafonte. Died not too long ago at 96. And I had the good fortune to spend some time with him. And I was fascinated with him because he was 96 years in the struggle. We know of him as a superstar. The first artist to sell 1 million records the same year that Elvis Presley sold 1 million records. The first was a black man named Harry Belafonte, who always understood his art as political. Deo, that song, that most famous song of his, he says, that's a work song. That's a radical song. He says, I charm them, and then I bring them into the fold. Who bankrolled the civil rights movement, who was Martin Luther King's one of his close friends, who put his own life physically on the line. I want to end with something that Harry said. We were talking, and he says, we dissolve the past into the inevitability of the present, as if this world of ours had to be, as if there were no others, slipping away from us even now if we don't struggle for them. I say, the question you asked, we'd been talking for a while, was how do you be a truth teller? Belafonte deadpans. Find out what the reward is for truth telling. He means his friend Martin found out. You get killed. I say, maybe you get to stand on a stage in Montgomery, Alabama. He had led that second march from Selma to Montgomery, and he stood on a stage outside the governor's office, and they sang terribly. They were so exhausted and tired, but it's a beautiful moment. You get to stand on a stage in Montgomery, Alabama at the end of a long march and sing a couple of songs. And Harry says, that's the best stage there is. Because in all these things, he warns, there is death right afterward. There was a very successful march, boom, the civil rights time now. Medgar Evers murdered. There was the March on Washington, and then 4 little girls. That was the 16th Street Baptist church bombing in Birmingham. Every time, he says, after that day in Montgomery, when he stood on that stage, Klansmen murdered a mother of 5 who was driving marchers back to Selma. Belafonte says, after every great victory, a great murder. They're going to let you know you didn't win. And that's why he says he's been angry for so long. He was in his early 90s by then. It's what keeps him alive. But there's the thing about anger and the long struggle. He says, where your anger comes from, he says, is less important than what you do with it. What do you do with it? What he's always done. You take it from the top. You sing your song again until they hear it like it's the first time. You make it your own, and then you give it away. And this, I think, is Harry Belafonte's idea of democracy, and it's one I believe in it. The idea that for a while, at least the length of a song, it is possible not to be scared even. Thank you.